I really want to dive into the nuance of insulin. So one thing that I feel like is the world understands that insulin resistance causes diabetes, type 2 diabetes. We also know when I can't lose weight, I must be insulin resistant. But outside of that, or maybe I know if I go to my doctor's office and my hemoglobin A1C is high, outside of that, I feel like we're insulin resistant illiterate. Like we don't understand what exactly it is. So can you talk about what some of the signs are? Let's start there. How would I know that I'm insulin resistant outside of those things that I just mentioned?
Yeah. First off, I mean, with insulin resistance in the first place, it's nebulous territory because people want to pick it apart as like, okay, well, we can't really talk about reducing insulin. We can't do because insulin is important and we need it and yada, yada. But when you look at the fact that, like 40% of adults are, at least 40% of adults are insulin resistant, that tells us there's a lot going on. There's probably a larger number than that. And it is something. So in a healthy individual, like insulin management isn't as important of a thing. Problem is that the lion's share of people are not healthy individuals. So it does become very important. And yeah, people think insulin resistance, they think, okay, well, I just have to measure my glucose and then just have to look at that. And even that can give you really skewed results because you're not measuring your insulin, right? You might eat some carbohydrates, you might eat some potatoes and then measure your glucose and your glucose goes to 160 and 180 and you think you're insulin resistant when in reality, if you were to measure 2 hours later and everything went back down, your body essentially did what it's supposed to do, right? So it's not just and that's where people think, okay, insulin resistance and high blood glucose, although they do go hand in hand, they're not the same thing. They're not the exact same thing. And one of the first ones that I want to talk about specifically is extreme hunger. Like it just flat out. Like if you wake up in the morning and you are really, really hungry, I mean, it is a very simple thing that your body is neglecting fuel. It's avoiding fuel because it can't receive the fuel, right? Yep. So it makes sense that you would be very, very hungry. And there's really just interesting research about how insulin plays a role with the brain. And I talked about this recently in a video, so it's very fresh in my mind. There was a study where they gave subjects intranasal insulin. And if you give someone intranasal insulin, it can cross the blood-brain barrier pretty quick and they can do that stuff. So they gave half the subjects a placebo, half the subjects intranasal insulin. And then they did an fMRI scan where they looked at their brain activity. And they found that the subjects that received insulin, that the insulin actually traveled to the brain, they ended up having better connectivity between the brain and the body and ultimately ended up having a better connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampal region. And essentially what that is saying is that if insulin actually gets where it's supposed to go and gets to the brain and gets into the cells in the brain, it can actually impact in a very positive way our satiety and how we actually crave food. But when we are insulin resistant, it goes beyond just what's happening in the periphery, like where our cells aren't getting nutrients. It literally, like if the insulin is not reaching its target properly and we're not even getting insulin in the brain, we could argue that it's altering our satiety cues, especially in the morning because most people are, they haven't been eating all night. So they're already waking up, they're in a fasted state and they're going to be more hungry. So it just makes sense that would be exacerbated in someone that's insulin resistant. And it's such a simple thing that it gets often overlooked.
So are you saying then, and this is a key point, that I could love the number on the scale, I could be the thinnest person in the world, but if I'm hungry all day, I can't go without food, that could be the beginning signs of insulin resistance?
In a lot of ways, yes. Yeah, because it's, weight is not always a direct reflection, right? Whether you're underweight or overweight. I don't want to say that, being overweight is healthy, but there are people that are overweight that are not insulin resistant, right? Adipose tissue in and of itself is sort of a master regulator of a lot of things and has its own set of problems, but it doesn't necessarily constitute an insulin resistance issue and vice versa, right? Like if you're also satiated or you're not that hungry all the time, like sometimes that can be a late stage insulin resistance issue. And the reason that I mention that is that imagine you have gone so long with your body not recognizing glucose very well. Okay. And this has happened for years and it went unrecognized. Well, at a certain point, your body has no choice but to upregulate fatty acid oxidation. It has no choice because it's been deprived of fuel. So in an advanced stage of insulin resistance, kind of moving towards diabetes, this happens. Like you can actually see where in diabetes, like a lot of times they actually increase the rate of fat oxidation because their body is forced to have to use another substrate. So the reason I mention that is like that can arguably be good for people with weight, for weight loss, but it's not exactly the way you want to go for it, right? It's not, you don't want to, I want to become diabetic so that my body oxidizes fat. That's not the goal.
Right.
So it's a very interesting thing. So usually when you start feeling the lack of hunger, a lot of times you notice that happen with like a type 1 diabetic, where it's a very extreme situation, right? Where they're no insulin, they need artificial insulin or exogenous insulin, and they get to a point, but they don't know it yet, right? It's like I have a family member that didn't realize they were type 1 diabetic until they're in their mid 20s, and yeah, couldn't put on weight, right? It was like the body is neglecting glucose. So it's one of those things to really pay attention to.